5 years in the way that organizations are performing. When we look at the leading institutions around the world, the overriding factor why sustainability and environment became an important part of their strategy was related to cost savings and the ability to provide better productivity within their organizations. And if we look at the latest statistics and surveys, we see that about 80% of organizations who are leading in this field would say that cost saving and productivity is a key factor when operating in a sustainable manner. But naturally with that comes the fact that a cultural change takes place when that occurs. Once you can see and provide transparency through solutions such as environmental management systems, and you can see solutions through cost-saving technology, you start to change the culture of your organization and drive it forward in a more sustainable way. We also talked a little bit today and saw a little bit of examples of how corporations see retention and differentiation in their product as a key factor due to sustainability. And we're now seeing a change in the fact that the traditional ways of handling business in logistics and the supply chain are changing. And that environment becomes a very, very important part of retaining your client base and differentiating your product in the long term. And naturally, the fourth element is that we see client pressure is increasing. And I think we're going to continue to see dramatic increases in client pressure as we go forward in the forthcoming years. One of the areas that have really changed is that we're showing some graphs here of top 20 shipping lines around the world. And 5 years ago, very few of these lines actually had any certifications related to environment at all. Now, approximately 90% of those carriers are now certified with either ISO certifications or sustainable certifications. They're trying to differentiate their brand through proof of their capabilities in this field. A lot of the shipping lines are also creating far more differentiating through award schemes. Traditionally, Maersk was the leader, but now we see a lot of other carriers around the world also driving awards and gaining awards and recognition through their capabilities and sustainability. And as we see a lot of different strategies in place, I highlight in dark blue some of the new areas, which is in e-commerce, in e-technology, in monitoring systems, and in using relationships with port operators and their customers to drive better metrics in place. We also see within the 3PL world that there's been a dramatic change in the way that they operate. Certification programs within the 3PL world are also very commonplace, and I was very interested to see what DHL is doing. DHL have had some tremendous innovation in that field. But around the third-party logistics world, the graph underneath shows that they're also working very heavily in CO2 reduction programs. And the only way that they can do that is to measure their CO2 footprint more effectively. Environmental training as a culture is becoming more important. And certification programs also are the key factors that are driving the third-party logistics field. So we're seeing some very definitive trends in that area. The reason why we're seeing these changes, I think, is that there's an increase in pressure from a multitude of areas surrounding logistics companies. 5 years ago, it was felt that customers would provide the pressure. But what we're seeing in this day and age is governments are also now legislating far more strongly than previously. We're seeing green government incentives in Asia, as well as in Europe, and in the United States. Green governments also create green legislation, and the shipping industry is considered one of the most polluting industries in the world. As a result, it's inevitable that small, medium-sized enterprises and large companies are likely to have to face far more stringent contingency plans around mandatory environmental laws. So whilst this changes the mindset of organisations and forces us to look at monitoring tools and software as a means of being more effective, we also see that the customers for logistics companies are much more sustainable than 5 years ago as well. So they're driving far more innovation, far more strategy in place, and expecting logistics companies to respond to that more effectively. And that creates a need to monitor your product more effectively. Just to give you some emphasis on what we see around Asia, to be Asia-centric, it was very interesting to note that China's 12th five-year plan was very heavily focused around sustainability for the first time. And we're seeing some very definitive changes in the way that China expects organisations in China to run their business. They talk about non-fossil fuel reductions, water consumption reductions, energy consumption, and carbon dioxide emission reductions as part of the 12th five-year plan. And as a result, we think that the entire industry and the supply chain will be forced to adapt to those types of requirements. As well as that, forest coverage and forest stock is expected to increase. Not just China, but Australia, who now started to introduce carbon taxation as part of their operating necessity. The top 500 polluters are expected to face carbon taxation as part of the Australian legislation. And that's expected to be about 17 euros per tonne of carbon, which is a very significant number. Coal and mining at the moment is the area that is being most closely monitored. But we expect to see that when it reduces, when they look at their long-term reduction program of 160 million tonnes of carbon emission by 2020, every sector, including industries such as the logistics and supply chain industries, will be affected by that requirement. Surprisingly, India, which is considered one of the more backward areas of sustainability, have also launched their 12th five-year plan and focused very strongly on sustainability as well. Dharam Ramesh talked about the need for India to become one of the most sustainable countries in the world. And they're doing that through the reduction of CO2 emissions by 20% by 2020. They're looking at green innovation within the country as a need to drive innovation within India. And they're looking at clean tech and environment as a new industry within that sector. So we can see some very definitive changes in countries that traditionally were not considered to be so environmentally friendly. From the logistics industry point of view, the issue still remains that customers are driving the environmental footprint. Around the world, we see a lot of global institutions. We talked about Walmart today, but we can name at least another dozen very well recognized organizations such as Marks and Spencer, such as Siemens, such as Tesco's, who are really heavily focused on driving sustainable brands and leading in the sustainable field. As a result, it's inevitable that logistics companies have to also be sustainable to meet the structural and strategic requirements of their clients. And so we believe that this will be a long-term strategy to drive better sustainability within the logistics industry. We've already started to see port operators and shipping lines operate much more sustainably. Port operators such as Long Beach in California were the first to really drive this element, but it's now spread through to the ports of Hamburg, throughout Europe, and into the United States, and even in parts of Asia. We also see that there's ratings associated with ports. Green Ports, as an operator, now provides ratings on the greenness of ports. Shipping lines have also become much more sustainable. As I said earlier, we believe that Maersk was considered the greenest of all the carriers, but now organizations such as APL, EVA, and Evergreen, OOCL, MOL, Asian carriers, are now getting tremendous kudos for being much more sustainable and innovating in the sustainable world. And they've done that by developing significantly better monitoring tools than what they had years ago. Throughout the industry, it's not just the shipping lines, the airlines as well. In fact, possibly the airlines have the toughest of all the challenges. Because of legislation, because of drive, air freight, ocean freight carriers are all forcing themselves to look very strongly at their CO2 footprint and measuring CO2 footprint more effectively. And we're seeing not just the international carriers, but we're seeing budget carriers and smaller carriers also focusing on CO2 footprint strategy in the long term. And even further down the line, the third-party logistics providers, the likes of Schenker, we saw a little bit about DHL, FedEx, TNT, amongst a whole multitude of international brands, are differentiating and competing on their capabilities around sustainability. A lot of it comes down to their ability to provide long-term strategies and strong strategies in place, but as much as anything, it's also to do with the ability to monitor and support more closely with their clients' needs as to how to become sustainable. And this focus, we believe, will also continue down the road to middle-sized organizations, regional organizations, and local organizations. The biggest challenge that we're seeing is, as a global business such as logistics, legislation is altering around the world all the time. We know that Europe is continuing to lead in legislation and focusing attention on a great deal of new metrics and new mandatory carbon reporting programs. Companies in Asia still have to be involved in mandatory carbon reporting if they want to work in places such as Europe. So legislation is forcing organizations to be much better in terms of their carbon monitoring, but also organizations and environmental law policies around Canada, the United States, and even in Asia, in places like India and China, are becoming more prevalent. And as a result, we can see that there will be a lot more need to be very accurate and verified in the way that you do your carbon reporting in the long term, to avoid areas such as carbon taxation and cap and trade schemes, or to reduce the amount of carbon taxation, should I say. Europe is very interesting because of the emission trading schemes that have been very heavily focused on in the last year or two. And already we're seeing that aviation sector is now very heavily focused on being able to monitor their carbon footprint, because every time they fly into Europe, there will be eventual needs to be providing